Regulars here know that I take great pride in my rather enormous collection of popular music from particularly the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, AKA the golden years of music. And so much in there really intrigues me and delights me, and I still remember so many things. I can't find my keys from time to time, but I can remember the words to an obscure song from the 1960s as long as it's playing, and it sort of jogs my mind. So as I thought about the calling of the disciples, I kept coming back to a song from a group that originally were called the Detroit Spinners. Later they became the Motown Spinners. None of us would really know that. We know them really, if you know anything about early 70s music, as the Spinners. It was an African-American group with a sign of a Motown sound that was sort of moving as many things did in the 70s, the decade of Soul Train and all those other different shows. Their big hits happened in a really small period of time. This was typical for that particular era. And the song that jumped in my mind was released, I remember, during the Christmas season of my senior year of high school. That would have been the very end of 1972, moving into 73, and my going off to college, which I suppose is so nostalgic to me. I love the music from all around that particular era. The song was simple, called Could It Be I'm Falling in Love. It was very melodic, but what was interesting about it, and as I really reflect on this, even more interesting than I first thought when I wanted to choose it to open tonight's message, is that very little music concerns itself with the question that seems so normative for most people when they are on the cusp of falling in love, but they don't realize that they are yet. As they look back, they see they fell in love, but in the moment it doesn't look that way. And the confusion and all the thing that comes to it is really part of the human experience. The song itself phrases it much better than I do, and so I'll read the words to you that signal this theme I'm speaking of. Since I met you, the song begins, I've begun to feel so strange. Every time I speak your name, that's funny. You say that you are so helpless too, that you don't know what to do. Later, say you feel the same way too, and I wonder what it is I feel for you. Instantly more memorable is the chorus or the refrain. Could it be I'm falling in love? Could it be I'm falling in love? Could it be I'm falling in love with you, with you? This question, could it be I'm falling in love, also can be found in other forms. That's why it began to appeal to me. When I work with engaged couples to marry, Emily's one of the very first ones I work with. From the very beginning, I've always done this, that I want to learn how the couple met. What was the thing about their meeting story? And I look for something to begin the homily with that comes out of that. Over the years, I've refined that approach. First practice with that as a young priest with a young couple, but I've refined that approach to really work on learning the origins of the couple's romance, to make them talk about it, so much of its past history that they began to stop thinking about what it was like when you really didn't know yet that you'd fall in love. You weren't really sure of what those feelings were, and you were certainly not sure what the other person felt. That's a very natural process as a romantic love begins to develop. And so it was So in those meeting stories is a phenomenon that I think is really helpful, which is that we look back, we pick minor details to tell the story. I've never had a couple spend a lot of time on the meeting story. It's interesting if they disagree about when they met. And every 1 in 30 has a confusion about who's right, about who met who first, and what the circumstances were. Most of the time, they're pretty much on the same page. Emily and her husband, Monty, for example, met in Fiddler on the Roof, a play that's so filled with matchmaking and falling in love. Why not marry somebody when you've met them from there? So you see, the idea is that we don't really know when it's happening, what is happening. So I want to frame that with the call of the apostles to give us a more mature, adult way to look at what happened that extraordinary day. It seemed when Jesus walked down the Sea of Galilee and was plucking apostles out of the water like he was plucking grapes from a vine or something. rapidity with which Matthew writes this story seems almost startling. He's walking by, he sees a total stranger, someone he's never seen before. Well, he's God, he's seen everyone before, but I mean, but they have not seen him. And so there they are, you know, John and Andrew minding their business. They're commercial fishermen. They've got a business, successful enterprise, work that is to be done. He says, drop your nets, I'll make you fishers of men, come follow me. And they went, okay, so they do. And then you get two more later, John and his brother, and John and James, and their father Zebedee. They leave him behind in the boat where they're supposedly mending nets. And once again, it seems so instantly. Could it be that I'm falling in love? I think when we learn something about how the Gospels were written, this will help us not take that text so literally. The Gospels were written decades after the events happened and often relied on eyewitness testimony, stories, anecdotes that had been given to them. And the purpose of each Gospel, including our Gospel, Matthew, was designed to appeal to a certain audience. Matthew, for example, was writing to first century Jews in the hopes that they would into this new, not even yet called Christian practice. His whole gospel is all about that, littered with Jewish characters who choose to follow Jesus. And so he wants to tell the story that the apostles were called, and he doesn't want to spend a lot of time telling that story because he has so much more important story to go. And let's face it, what kind of gospel would it be if, like going out on a first date, they were trying to figure out who the strange guy was with the long hair and what would he mean by that? What do you mean by following? You mean I'm going to leave my nets, all of that. So that's edited out of the story. That word immediately they followed him could be better understood as something that developed over a quick period of time in almost the exact same way. I hear people tell me again and again and again how they fell in love. And so the story opens a window to how God works with us. And God works with us by allowing us to experience falling in love with him. The idea of falling in love with God is that it must be of God's initiative, which it is, and that we must go through what is, for all of us, the difficult process of figuring it out. Am I in love with God? Is God really in love with me? As a priest of almost 24 years, people ask me that question literally all the time, trying to navigate circumstances that are happening in their life, make sense of things that are happening. Sometimes for people, the most sensible thing is this happened to me because God's mad at me or God is punishing me, a narrative that will not be supported the New Testament by anything that Jesus was announcing to his disciples when he told them to come and follow him. That process, though, where we have to go through the necessary process of falling in love, and those who've been married a long time know it does not stop after the first couple of weeks of falling in love. Frequently, that's the phase where you're unbearable being around other people, and thankfully, that doesn't last very long. But people do have to spend their entire life falling in love over and over again and again, just like priests have to fall in love over and over again with their vocations. In the wedding homily, I will frequently speak of when it was that the couple first became single. And they first become single at a moment that's really not available to their memory, when they were conceived in their mother's womb. In the words of Psalm 139, when you knit me together in my mother's womb. It's an inauspicious moment. Only God knows the moment. No one else really knows. Parents will find out soon enough, but it'll be a period of weeks at least, and even then it will remain a mystery. They're not really quite sure what is there. But you see, God's knowledge is instantaneous because he is the maker, he is the creator. I'm saying God fell in love with us the minute we were created, the instant we were created, and he has always been in love, always is in love, and will be in love with us. That's just simply a constant of our faith. Now the question is, can two do this? Can we fall in love with God? We don't have his benefits of being creators, and we don't have his omniscience, and we don't have his powerfulness. He asks none of that thing for us. We have to choose to fall in love and to trust that that relationship is foundational in our lives. That's the only way it makes sense, that the apostles abandoned their nets and followed him. Rather than just a seductive follow me, it was something more deep, and it took a very long time for them to learn. I've only fallen in love once in my life, and at the time I didn't actually know it, which is, again, as I've learned through my priestly ministry, rather typical, that you look back and see what was happening, but the lack of information and our own insecurities usually prevents us from noticing it. I met at a party that was from a mutual acquaintance, and we were the only two attorneys at the party, and so the acquaintance thought one way to solve two people, it would be difficult to get them to meet anybody, is let the two attorneys talk to each other. I run into that throughout my life, but that particular one was quite consequential. But at the moment, I was simply doing the thing you would do at somebody's party, meeting a stranger you hadn't met, and just simply having a conversation and trying to figure out, is this something or is it not? And it would be quite some time before I'd be able to look back and actually retrace the steps and see how they developed. I'd like to think you could do that live while the action's unfolding, but as I look into my own life, I realize how difficult that is. Part of that would be my reticence. It probably explains why I'm a celibate priest. I'm very reticent to jump into relationships. I really wanted a neon sign, and that from what I've now learned, almost no one gets one of those. So that someone has to risk. Somebody has to say, are you interested? Would we like to take this a little bit further or whatever? Something I'm terribly averse to. I guess that's why I love this scene in the movie White Christmas, one of my very favorites. And it's early on where they're on the train and they're headed to Vermont, and it's rather obvious Bob and Betty are attracted to each other in the same way Phil and Judy are attracted to each other. But Phil and Judy are conniving, just like the matchmaker in Fiddler on the Roof, to try and get Bob and Betty together. So when they stop in Vermont, Betty steps down and Bob helps her from the little boat, and they look at each other. And so Judy says to Phil, news flash, she never makes the first move. Phil looks back at Judy and goes, news flash, she's in there with the champ. That so completely describes me and many other people I've come to learn, that we're slow to move, slow to risk, slow to see signs. It's simply part of the process. Not meant to be frustrating. It's the epic center of romantic comedy, is that whole notion of the mistaken notion of trying to figure things out. And all of that really is what the Spinners were talking about. Could it be that I'm falling in love? So what I'm saying is the mysteries that come through our lives, and they come through all of our lives, are ways that you and I begin to recognize as we feel out of sorts, as we feel somewhat unbalanced, as we're not really sure what the direction is going, that we're not being manipulated as much as we're giving extra space to move, to see, to discover, to learn, and to continue. The continuing is the key part. To continue to fall in love with God. And it is that experience that gives us a rich spiritual life. A rich spiritual life does not mean you're happy all the time. No one is. And it doesn't mean you've got all your questions answered. No one has all their questions answered. It doesn't mean that there aren't dark times. Everybody has dark times. There's really no evading any of that. That the truth is that those moments are different when they're understood as a part of the pattern of the process of falling in love and dealing with the different signs that happen in the world. I guess the story from my own life after when I moved from Louisville to Washington, D.C., and I've shared with you all before, I spent 12 years of my life not going to church other than Christmas and Easter. Turns out I'm not the only one that felt that way, but I did that for about 12 years. And then I began to think about going back to church, mostly because I had two friends that were Christian brothers, and they were going to church regularly. But I never did. It was like saying, I think I'm going to start exercising, and then I really wouldn't. One day I was coming home from work, and I took the subway every day. That's what you do when you live in Washington, D.C. And where I lived on the Red Line in D.C., the escalator out of the metro was a monster. It took 3 minutes to go up that escalator. So there was this downtime when you're standing on an escalator waiting to go up. Oh, some people go up steps at a time. They're fools, because it's like 3 miles to the top of that escalator. So I just always got used to standing there and doing whatever. One day in November of 1990, on that escalator ride that I took every day of my working life, I suddenly said, I think I'm going to start going to church. And I started going that weekend. And other than 2 times I was sick on a Sunday, I haven't missed a Sunday Mass since November of 1990. I didn't understand then what that would mean. In fact, I didn't even think that had anything to do with spiritual. Like most people, I kind of thought that was myself. I was doing this thing that I was thinking about, sort of like exercising, wondering how long that's really going to last. And yet it was a transformative life change that would have scared the living daylights out of me if I'd been told at that moment, oh, you're going to abandon the job that pays infinitely more than this job, and you're going to go back to school, and you're going to become a priest. I think I would have ran back down the escalator in the other direction. Those changes in my life would come later after I fell in love and continued to unpack what was happening. The same is true for every one of us. We all have the story of our life. We all have things that are happening. We want to make sense of all of that. So when we gather together as a community, we bring all of our various different stories here. And we find ourselves as a group of people still trying to fall in love with God and to really believe that God has always loved us and always will love us. Tonight we will receive Holy Communion. There is no greater expression of love that God can possibly give than to give the entirety, the totality of His self. There's nothing more than that, which is what we receive in Eucharist, which is why the church calls it the perfect sacrifice. Not perfect because you offer it, not perfect because I offer it, perfect because God, who is perfect, offers it. It is the unequivocal sign that He has always been in love with us and always will be in love with us. So maybe if we're haunted by the questions that haunt each and every one of us, we shouldn't say, why do I feel this way? Or I wonder what it is that I'm supposed to do. Or an attempt to try and whatever action we think is happening, when something is happening that involves our doing something. Maybe we should catch our breath and realize in the midst of all that uncertainty and mystery, it's a much more simple question. Ask ourselves, could it be that I'm falling in love?